How does a man who once slept in the back seat of a car become one of the most powerful voices on American television? Steve Harvey built an empire out of laughter. He is the unmistakable voice of Family Feud, the sharp wit that wakes millions each morning on the Steve Harvey Morning Show, and a comedian whose glance or perfectly timed reaction can send an audience into roaring laughter. Yet long before the bright stage lights, before the tailored suits and the cheering crowds, Steve Harvey was a homeless stand-up comic sleeping in an old car, wondering if the world would ever hear him. The journey from those cold nights to global fame might look like destiny, but every step forward carved its own scars. Marriages collapsing during the most relentless years of his ambition, debts that once followed him like shadows, and a humiliating mistake broadcast live to the entire world that nearly erased everything he had built. The world hears the laughter, but it rarely sees the battles that forged it. Now, at 69, the smile remains, and the microphone is still firmly in his hand. Yet the echoes of old storms are beginning to rise again, sharper than ever. What happens when the past refuses to stay buried? If you believe Steve Harvey is one of the most extraordinary voices television has ever produced, take a moment to honor not only the entertainer the world applauds, but the man who refused to fall when life tried again and again to close every door in front of him. The life millions would one day admire did not begin with applause. It began with a sound, thin, sharp, and unforgettable, the tearing of a sheet of paper where a dream had just been written. Steve Harvey, born January 17, 1957, in the coal mining town of Welch, West Virginia, grew up in a place where opportunity moved slowly and expectations moved even slower. His father, Jesse Harvey, spent long shifts underground as a miner, coal dust often following him home on the soles of his boots. His mother, Eloise Vera, returned from the classroom with chalk still clinging to her hands, stretching a teacher's salary to feed and clothe 5 children. There were no stage lights in that house, only the quiet, constant pressure of survival. When the family later moved to Cleveland and settled along East 112th Street, the sidewalks were cracked, winters were unforgiving, and most dreams did not travel far beyond simply getting through the day. Decades later, that same street would carry the name Steve Harvey Way, but when he first walked those blocks with worn shoes and cautious hope, it was just another neighborhood where someone tried to imagine a life larger than the one surrounding him. Food was thin among 5 siblings, coats were patched until the fabric weakened, and winter winds slipped through walls that could never quite keep the cold away. And layered quietly above it all was another weight: growing up black in the American Midwest during the 1960s, a time and place where ambition could sound unrealistic even before it was spoken aloud. Looking back years later, Harvey would reflect that in those early days, simply holding on to a dream sometimes felt like the bravest thing he possessed. School offered little relief. His stutter turned every sentence into a small struggle, syllables catching before they could fully escape his mouth. Classmates laughed easily. Embarrassment stayed longer. Yet the moment that carved itself deepest into memory came during a simple classroom assignment asking students to write about their future. With careful, trembling handwriting, he wrote one line: he wanted to be on television. For a brief second, the room grew quiet. Then the laughter spread across the desks. The teacher lifted the paper, looked at it, and tore it cleanly in half. In that instant, the message was unmistakable. A poor child from Cleveland who struggled to speak clearly did not belong on television screens. Years later, Harvey would still remember the sound of that paper tearing. "I can still hear it," he once said. "That sound stayed with me longer than anything anyone said that day." His mother carried the embarrassment home in silence, but his father answered the moment differently. Jesse Harvey looked at his son, and told him to write the dream again, tape it to the wall, and read it every morning and every night until it became part of him. And he did exactly that. The torn sheet was replaced by another. The sentence became a quiet ritual, spoken before school, repeated again before sleep. When Steve Harvey graduated from Glenville High School in 1974, the vow still followed him, somewhere between belief and stubborn determination. Years later, when television screens across America carried his voice into millions of homes, he never forgot the classroom where the paper had been torn. Every Christmas, he sent that same teacher a new television set with a short note attached. Never angry, never boastful, simply a quiet reminder that the dream once dismissed in her classroom had eventually found its way into living rooms across the country. Time did not erase those early wounds. It reshaped them. The laughter in classrooms, the torn paper, the long walks along East 112th Street, none of it vanished. Instead, those memories settled into something steadier than pain, discipline, persistence, and a quiet resolve that would later reveal itself when audiences saw only the confidence and timing of a performer on stage. The voice that once stumbled would eventually command a room with a single pause. Yet beneath the lights, Harvey has often suggested that earlier version of himself never completely disappeared. The crowds grew larger, the voice grew stronger, and the life around him changed in ways that classroom could never have imagined. But somewhere beneath the laughter remained the memory of standing beside a torn sheet of paper, and the quiet decision made that day not to let the future tear with it. The distance between a dream written on a small piece of paper and the roar of a comedy stage once felt impossible to cross. The boy who once fought to push broken syllables through a stubborn stutter in a Cleveland classroom did not step into success. He wandered through years that seemed to grind ambition down one ordinary day at a time. Winter mornings found him delivering mail through wind that numbed his fingers until they barely moved. Other days, he bent over carpets, scrubbing until his knuckles burned raw. He knocked on strangers' doors, selling insurance, only to have them slammed shut in his face without a single word. Grease darkened his hands while he repaired engines as a mechanic. Some nights, he stepped into boxing rings, trading bruises for paychecks that vanished almost immediately. And every road ended the same way, thin pockets and a spirit stretched close to breaking. Still, one stubborn sentence refused to die. The promise he once wrote about appearing on television. Years later, he would remember how that dream hovered in his mind like a weak lantern flickering inside a tunnel that seemed to have no end. The night that changed everything arrived quietly. In 1985, inside a smoky Cleveland comedy club where the air hung heavy and the crowd waited impatiently for laughter, a friend nudged him toward the stage during an open mic. With little left to protect, Steve Harvey stepped beneath the lights, his chest tight with nerves. The first line stumbled out unevenly. The second found its rhythm. Suddenly, the room cracked open for a heartbeat. Laughter burst through the room like heat breaking a long winter. For a moment, he simply stood there, stunned by the sound of it. When the host placed $50 in his hand, Steve walked out into the cold night with tears in his eyes. Under a lonely street lamp, he stared at the crumpled bill and whispered to himself that something inside him had finally come alive. The next morning, he walked away from his job. For the first time, the road ahead no longer felt like wandering. What followed was not triumph, but survival. For nearly 3 years after that night, Steve Harvey slept not in apartments or hotels, but in the back seat of a worn 1976 Ford. The car became everything: his roof, his kitchen, and the narrow seat where he folded his tall frame into the cramped space night after night. knees pressed against the steering wheel, waiting for morning to arrive faster. A small cooler in the trunk served as his refrigerator. Gas station sinks and public pool showers became his bathrooms. Hunger stayed with him constantly. Cheap sandwiches were stretched across days, and some nights sleep was the only escape from the ache of an empty stomach. Winter air crept through the metal frame of the car, turning long nights into cold endurance. After midnight, he watched frost slowly creep across the windshield while the car sat in absolute silence, and prayed none of them would glance through the glass and realize the man inside had nowhere else to go. Later, he admitted those nights forced one quiet question: how long belief can survive when nothing around you suggests it should? Still, every morning and night, he repeated the ritual his father once demanded, reading the dream again as if those words alone could keep him moving. Eventually, even that faith nearly slipped away. One evening, exhausted and uncertain, he reached for the phone, ready to tell his father the road had grown too heavy. But before dialing, he pressed play on his answering machine. 2 messages waited. One offered a comedy show in Jacksonville for $150. The second promised another the following night for the same amount. $300, just enough for a cheap flight to New York, where producers from Showtime at the Apollo wanted him on stage. One missed call could have ended everything. Even then, help arrived quietly. A couple named Rich and Becky Liss saw his determination and offered him a carpet-cleaning contract, along with credit for travel. Their faith restored a piece of dignity hardship had nearly taken from him. Years later, with emotion in his voice on national television, Harvey reached out to thank them publicly. The hunger, rejection, and silent nights inside that car did not break him. They forged the man the world would later recognize as a legend. Stage lights don't just shine, they expose the road someone walked to reach them. In 1990, Steve Harvey stepped beneath the blazing lights of Harlem as a finalist in the Johnny Walker National Comedy Search. Years earlier, the same voice had struggled through a stutter in a Cleveland classroom. Now it cut through the room with timing so sharp the laughter came like thunder. The applause didn't sound like approval. It sounded like a door finally breaking open. Soon after, the doors of Showtime at the Apollo opened as well. Harvey walked onto that legendary stage carrying more than a microphone. Behind the curtain stood a man who had known hunger, ridicule, and nights shivering inside a car that once felt less like shelter and more like a witness to defeat. Harlem answered him anyway. With every laugh that rolled across the theater, the distance between who he had been and who he might become grew smaller. Years later, he would remember the moment quietly. When they laughed that night, it felt like someone turning the lights back on in my life. For 7 years, he carried Apollo's energy like a banner into battle. Harlem's stage lights replaced the cold glow of gas station lamps that once lit the parking lots where he slept. Crowds filled theaters where silence once surrounded him. But success arrived with velocity. Hosting, touring, rewriting jokes until sunrise, days stretched into 18-hour marathons that strained his voice and drained his body. Harvey later explained the strange equation behind his comedy with blunt honesty. Most jokes people loved started with something that hurt first. Pain became timing. Humiliation became rhythm. The audience saw confidence. The man delivering it carried scars they could not see. And as television carried his face into homes across America, even the teacher who once tore apart his childhood dream now saw him everywhere, every week, every screen. The climb only steepened. In 1994, he starred in Me and the Boys, and by 1996, The Steve Harvey Show became a defining sitcom, running until 2002 and turning him into a household name. To millions, he represented something larger than comedy, proof that laughter could rise from struggle. Yet the rhythm of success carried quiet costs. Scripts blurred into stand-up sets, airport terminals replaced evenings at home, applause replaced sleep. Fame crowned him publicly while quietly taking time in return. Family dinners missed, birthdays watched from hotel rooms, children growing older while he stood under another spotlight. Harvey later admitted with painful clarity, "There were moments the world knew my name better than the people waiting for me at home." In the silence of hotel rooms, after the crowd disappeared, that truth could echo louder than applause. Then came the tour that sealed his legacy. From 1997 to 2000, Harvey joined Cedric the Entertainer, D.L. Hewley, and Bernie Mac for the historic Kings of Comedy tour. Arenas shook with laughter, and when Spike Lee captured the phenomenon in The Original Kings of Comedy, 2000, Harvey's place in stand-up history became permanent. For a man who once wondered if the world would remember him at all, hearing entire stadiums chant his name carried a beauty almost too overwhelming to hold. Yet even in triumph, his body whispered warnings, fatigue, pressure, the quiet weight of success carried too long. Looking back, he explained simply, "Every cheer reminded me where I started. Every spotlight reminded me how dark things used to be." His influence eventually moved beyond the stage. The voice once slowed by a childhood stutter began guiding millions. In 2009, he wrote Act Like a Lady, Think Like a Man, a New York Times bestseller later adapted into a successful film. More books followed: Straight Talk, No Chaser, 2010, Act Like a Success, 2014, and Jump, 2016, each drawn from lived experience rather than theory. Recognition followed: BET Humanitarian of the Year in 2011, a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 2013, multiple Daytime Emmys, and NAACP Image Awards, the renaming of his childhood street to Steve Harvey Way in 2015, and an honorary doctorate in 2016. Yet every award carried him back to a quieter memory, to nights inside that Ford, repeating his father's words. "Read the dream again," he remembered hearing. "Say it until quitting is no longer an option." Steve Harvey's rise was never a straight climb. It was closer to a slow resurrection built in stubborn steps. From Harlem stages to Hollywood honors, from packed arenas to best-selling pages, he turned ridicule into respect. But beneath the triumph remained the private weight of the journey. The exhaustion of years lived at full speed, the memory of empty chairs at family tables, the quiet knowledge that success had taken pieces of a life that could never be returned. Long before the world learned his name, a small promise had been written on a torn piece of paper. Decades later, the laughter of millions proved that the promise outlived everything that tried to erase it. A public collapse seldom arrives with warning. For Steve Harvey, it began beneath the merciless lights of the Miss Universe stage in December 2015. For decades, he had walked into rooms with the calm authority of a man who knew exactly how a crowd breathes. When laughter rises, when silence falls, when a single line can hold an entire theater still. That night seemed routine, another polished moment in a career built on command. Then the envelope opened. The cue card rose. His eyes moved across a name, and the wrong words slipped into the air. For the briefest instant, nothing happened. The theater held its breath all around. The crown touched her head. Applause began to rise, then shattered as confusion spread across the stage like a crack in glass. Cameras pushed in closer, searching his face as realization arrived. In that brutal second, the man who had built his life mastering a microphone felt the ground beneath his voice disappear. Years later, he would say the moment stretched unnaturally long, every second dragging behind it the weight of decades. There was nowhere to step away, no curtain fast enough to hide what had already been spoken. Under the same relentless lights, he stepped forward again, corrected the name, and apologized. His voice steady, but stripped of every defense. It became one of the most agonizing scenes ever broadcast live. A man standing before the world with nowhere left to hide, choosing truth while humiliation unfolded in full view of the planet. The backlash arrived with brutal speed. Within minutes, the moment spread across the internet like wildfire. Memes multiplied. Late-night comedians sharpened the mistake into endless punchlines. Headlines rushed to predict the collapse of a career that had taken decades to build. When Harvey walked behind the curtain that night, the quiet waiting backstage felt colder than any crowd he had ever faced. In the silent hours that followed, a single question circled relentlessly in his mind. Could 60 seconds erase a lifetime? Yet the instinct that had carried him through hunger, rejection, and nights sleeping in a car refused to let the story end there. 1 year later, he returned to host Miss Universe again, stepping back beneath the same lights that had once magnified his worst moment. This time, the stage meant something entirely different. It was no longer about crowns, ratings, or spectacle. It was about standing where the world had watched him fall and proving that dignity is not preserved by avoiding mistakes, but by returning after the mistake has already been seen by everyone. Another blow came from a quieter direction. In 2019, NBC abruptly canceled his daytime talk show Steve, a program he had built not simply as entertainment, but as a place where humor and lived experience shared the same stage. The decision arrived suddenly. Harvey learned of it almost at the same moment as the public, through headlines announcing the show's end. For many performers, such a moment feels like erasure, as if years of work can disappear overnight. Yet on the final taping, he stood before the audience that had shared countless moments with him and chose composure over resentment. Instead of dwelling on the loss, he spoke about chapters still waiting to be written. The words were calm, almost understated, but they carried the quiet strength of someone who had survived storms far harsher than a canceled television show. And the storms did not end there. Jokes sparked backlash. Casual remarks ignited headlines. In an era where every word can be replayed endlessly, Harvey learned how quickly a single sentence can travel beyond intention. Each controversy left its mark. Not the kind carved by poverty or homelessness, but the kind that tests dignity under constant public scrutiny. The same man who once slept in the backseat of a car now lived beneath a different form of exposure, the relentless glare of a culture that never forgets mistakes. Yet those trials did not erase him. They reshaped him. Over time, embarrassment hardened into discipline, criticism deepened into perspective, and the microphone he once used only for laughter became something heavier, a symbol of responsibility carried before millions. By the end of that turbulent decade, Steve Harvey had come to embody something larger than celebrity. The boy who once struggled to speak in a classroom, the man who once wondered where he would sleep, now stood before the world carrying every scar openly. And when the noise of judgment rose again around him, he returned to the place that had always defined him: the stage, the microphone, the breath of silence before the first word, proving that the measure of a life is not whether the voice ever trembles, but whether it has the courage to speak again after the watching world has already heard it break. But the crises the world witnessed beneath the glare of the stage lights were only the surface of the story. Long before Steve Harvey stood before cameras watched by millions, another chapter of his life had already begun, quietly, inside a small home where a young marriage and a growing family were slowly taking shape. The applause that would one day follow Steve Harvey across arenas and television studios began long before fame, but the first silence it created was inside his own home. In 1981, years before Apollo or television success, a 24-year-old Harvey married Marcia, a quiet, steady presence who believed in him when the world did not. At the time, he was only a young man carrying a pocket full of jokes and a dream far larger than his circumstances. Together they built a small family, twin daughters, Carly and Brandy, and a son, Broderick Jr. In those early years, the laughter in their home came not from audiences, but from children running across living room floors, convinced their father could fix anything. But the dream that was meant to lift them slowly began pulling him farther away. The 1980s were unforgiving. Harvey was still unknown, driving from one small club to another, chasing stage time wherever he could find it, sometimes sleeping in his car when the money disappeared. Nights under dim comedy lights meant mornings he was not there to see. Inside the house, cupboards thinned, bills gathered, and Marcia carried the quiet weight of holding the family together, stretching every dollar, calming hungry children, and watching the man she loved vanish deeper into a life that rarely paid enough to keep the lights on. Years later, looking back on those years with painful honesty, Harvey admitted something that still followed him long after success arrived. Chasing that stage cost me more than I understood at the time. The marriage began to unravel as the distance between ambition and family widened. The damage was measured not in miles, but in moments. Birthdays missed, dinners gone cold on the table, and the empty chair where a father should have been. Marcia was left raising 3 children almost alone as the twins began asking why their father was always somewhere else, while young Broderick Jr. learned to recognize his father's voice more from stories than from the man himself. By the time the divorce papers were signed in 1994, Steve Harvey stood nearly emptied out, his marriage gone, his money thin, and the dream that once promised to lift his family, now the only thing he still had left. A man who could make strangers collapse with laughter could not repair the silence inside his own house, where birthdays had passed without him, and a chair at the table had slowly become permanent. Marcia walked away carrying the quiet damage of broken trust, and their children carried something heavier, the memory of years when their father was chasing laughter in distant rooms instead of being there to say goodnight. The loss of that first family never fully left him. Yet in the shadow of that failure, something deeper took root. The experience carved a truth that would follow Harvey for the rest of his life. Every cheer, every stage, every moment the crowd rose to its feet was connected to choices made long before the spotlight ever arrived. And somewhere in the quiet spaces between those moments, the memory of Marcia and the children he once kissed goodnight remained part of the story that shaped the man the world would eventually applaud. Some silences begin the moment a marriage ends and never fully leave. By the mid-1990s, Steve Harvey was standing at the threshold of everything he had spent years chasing. Television cameras turning toward him, comedy audiences beginning to recognize his voice, doors that had once been closed slowly opening. Yet beneath the rising applause lingered the quiet weight of what success had already taken from him. A first marriage that had collapsed, and 3 children he now saw only in fragments of time. For nearly 2 years, his private life drifted through a strange emptiness. Airport lounges replacing living rooms, hotel corridors replacing family dinners, conversations cut short before another flight was called. It was in that unsettled stretch of life that he met Mary Shackelford. She did not arrive with spectacle, only steadiness, something rare in a world now moving around him at the speed of scripts, stages, and studio lights. To Steve, she felt less like a sudden romance and more like a second chance, quietly finding its way to him. In 1996, at 39, he married her believing the next chapter might finally move in a different direction. For a while, it truly did. Their home filled with the ordinary sounds of a family rediscovering rhythm. When their son Winton was born in 1997, Harvey held the boy as if he were something fragile that might disappear if he loosened his grip. Later, he would say the child quietly became the direction that kept him standing. Evenings slowed into small scenes. Steve stretched across the living room carpet while the baby crawled across his chest, Mary watching nearby with a tired but peaceful smile. Weekends meant backyard grills, bursts of laughter, photographs of a man who looked, if only for a moment, as though he had outrun the shadows of poverty and loneliness. For someone who had once slept in the back seat of a car with everything he owned packed into the trunk, the sound of a baby laughing inside his own home felt almost unreal, as if life had quietly returned something he once believed was gone for good. But storms rarely disappear. They simply circle wider before returning. At first, the strain arrived quietly. Missed calls, longer schedules, the subtle tension that grows when ambition and home begin pulling in opposite directions. Harvey's career accelerated quickly. Television tapings, Apollo appearances, the relentless travel of the kings of comedy tours. Mary longed for steadiness, dinners that did not end with another suitcase snapping shut, nights when the microphone did not claim her husband before dawn. Steve, still haunted by the fear of losing everything again, drove himself harder with every passing year. What began as small silences slowly sharpened into arguments, the same absence that had fractured his first marriage quietly finding its way back again. By 2005, the marriage finally gave way under pressures that had been building for years: distance, ambition, and the relentless gravity of a life lived on stage. Unlike the quiet heartbreak of his first divorce, this one unfolded beneath the unforgiving glare of public attention. Mary stepped forward with accusations that cut directly into the image Harvey had spent decades building. Though many claims would later be dismissed in court, the court of public opinion moved faster and with far less patience. The man whose face once appeared on billboards for laughter suddenly found his name filling headlines for reasons no comedian can prepare for. Years later, he would admit the divorce left marks deeper than reputation alone, marks that reached into both his spirit and the identity he had fought to build. Legal documents replaced scripts, depositions replaced punchlines. Interviews that should have celebrated his craft turned instead into interrogations of his character. For a man who once feared invisibility, the new reality was the opposite. Relentless exposure beneath a spotlight that never dimmed. Yet, the deepest fracture was waiting at home. Yet the deepest fracture was not public at all. It was the quiet distance that followed inside his own family. Winton was only 8 when his parents' marriage finally collapsed. After the divorce, the boy lived with his mother, leaving Steve with fragments of fatherhood, a weekend here, a holiday there, moments that always seemed to end too soon. Harvey later admitted that criticism from tabloids never cut as deeply as the confusion he sometimes saw in his son's eyes. In hotel rooms after long days on the road, he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, celebrated by millions yet unable to shield the one child who mattered most from the turbulence surrounding them. Years later, when Winton chose to live with him as a teenager, Harvey would describe it simply as a second chance he never expected. Looking back, those years felt less like a divorce and more like a crucible, a stretch of life where success, humiliation, fatherhood, and faith collided all at once. The man who had climbed from homelessness to national fame found himself stripped again, not of possessions, but of certainty. Still, he kept moving, even when he was no longer sure where the road ahead would lead. Faith steadied him. The simple duty of being a father gave him something to hold on to. Slowly, the scars hardened into something quieter, but stronger. Because the hardest battles of a life rarely happen beneath stage lights. They happen afterward, in the quiet of a room when the applause fades and a man is left alone with the life his choices have built. The collapse of a marriage is often loud in courtrooms, but quiet in the hours that follow. For Steve Harvey, the end of his second marriage in 2005 did not simply close a chapter. It exposed how fragile the ground beneath success could be. When the legal battles finally ended and the lawyers were paid, Harvey walked into a bank expecting relief. Instead, the ATM screen flickered and returned a number so small it felt unreal: $1,700. For a long second, he stood there unable to move, the bank suddenly silent, with his hand still on the machine, as if the screen might correct itself. It didn't. For a man whose face hung on billboards and whose voice filled arenas, the figure felt less like a balance and more like a verdict. Years later, he would recall that moment with painful clarity, admitting that the hardest part was not the number itself, but the contradiction. Being seen by millions as successful, while privately wondering how long he could keep breathing under the pressure. But the humiliation was only the beginning. For a brief moment, he believed the worst of it was over. He was wrong. Soon, another truth surfaced, one far heavier than an empty bank account. For 7 years, because of catastrophic accounting failures, his taxes had never been filed. Principal, interest, penalties, each year had quietly compounded until the total loomed like a storm gathering above him. Harvey had once feared losing his home. Now the fear was darker and more final. Prison, disgrace, the possibility that everything he had built could vanish in a single collapse. At night in hotel rooms, he stared at the ceiling, replaying the same 2 questions over and over. What happens if everything falls apart again? And what will my children see when it does? But the instinct that carried him through homelessness years earlier did not disappear inside that crisis. It sharpened. Harvey responded the only way he knew how, by working harder than the fear chasing him. Long before sunrise, he was already inside a radio studio, his voice traveling across the country as host of a morning show. That microphone became more than a job. It was the one place where control still existed. Later, he would say that every laugh he earned during those years carried a hidden weight, because behind each joke was the quiet urgency of survival. Discipline replaced comfort. Every dollar had purpose. Every opportunity became another step away from the edge. The days blurred into exhaustion. Radio before dawn, meetings through the afternoon, comedy stages late into the night. Out of that relentless rhythm came the pages of the books that followed. Act Like a Lady, Think Like a Man in 2009, then Straight Talk, No Chaser in 2010. Writing them was not simply a creative outlet. It was another way to keep moving forward while the debt behind him slowly shrank. Then, in 2010, a new door opened when Harvey stepped onto the stage as host of Family Feud. Within 3 years, the show surged to the highest ratings it had seen in decades. What began as another job slowly transformed into something larger, a return to the center of American living rooms, where his laughter once again filled the space between questions and answers. Even then, the climb out of the hole was slow and unforgiving. Harvey would later admit that for years, nearly every check he earned traveled directly to the IRS. Applause at night was followed by quiet hours, with calculators, paperwork, and prayers that the numbers would finally begin to move in his favor. Looking back, he once reflected that there were nights when he believed the story might truly end there. But somehow, the work kept him standing. Dollar by dollar, Performance by performance, the weight began to lift. By the end of that decade, the balance sheet had changed, but the experience left deeper marks than money ever could. The chapter that began with $1,700 and 7 years of unfiled taxes was not simply a financial crisis. It became something quieter and harder to see. Proof that the distance between admiration and ruin can be frighteningly thin, and that sometimes a life is rebuilt not in headlines, but in the stubborn decision to keep standing long after the applause has faded. Fame has a way of disguising the fractures in a life. By the mid-2000s, Steve Harvey had become a man audiences believed they understood, his voice filling arenas, his face glowing beneath television lights, laughter rising wherever he stepped on stage. From the outside, it looked like a rival. But the climb that carried him there had been steep enough to leave scars few people could see. 2 marriages had fallen apart along the way. His children had grown up learning the rhythm of a father who was often somewhere else. There were years when debt pressed against him like a wall closing in. Some nights, after the crowds were gone and hotel doors clicked shut, he would sit in silence and realize that survival and happiness were not always the same thing. Long before the world knew his name, in a Memphis comedy club, he had once pointed toward a woman in the crowd and joked that he would marry her someday. The moment passed. Life scattered them in different directions. But time has a strange patience with unfinished stories. In 2005, after storms that had bruised both his reputation and his spirit, their paths crossed again. 2 years later, at 50 years old, carrying more history than he ever imagined he would, Steve Harvey married Marjorie Bridges. The change that followed did not arrive with fireworks. It arrived quietly. Where success had taught him to keep running, Marjorie taught him how to stop. She interrupted the rhythm of exhaustion that had defined most of his adult life, reminding him to eat when he would have skipped meals, urging him to sleep when he would have worked through the night, grounding him in small, ordinary moments that fame rarely allows. In later years, Harvey would reflect that the greatest turning point of his life began not with a contract or a television deal, but with the peace that came after their marriage. Together they formed a blended family of 7 children. At first the word step lingered awkwardly between them, as it does in many families learning new shapes. Harvey refused to let that word define their home. He gave Marjorie's children his name. Slowly, patiently, they gave him their trust. Fatherhood became something quieter than the world imagined. Early morning school drives, late-night conversations that stretched past midnight, dinners where he listened far more than he spoke. Years later, one moment revealed just how much that quiet work had meant. During a live televised tribute in 2015, Marjorie's son Jason stood beside him and spoke directly to the man he now called father. He said that receiving Harvey's last name had changed the course of his life, and that no one deserved that title more. For a second, the room seemed to hold its breath. Cameras caught Harvey lowering his head, unable to answer, tears breaking through the smile audiences had known for decades. Long before that night, he had admitted, with painful honesty, that chasing his ambitions had cost him the closeness of his first family. Jason's words did not erase that history, but they carried something just as powerful. Proof that the damage left by old choices does not always have to remain permanent. Life with Marjorie reshaped the rhythm of his days in ways the public rarely saw. Evenings meant a table where every child, biological or adopted, sat together. Birthdays were celebrated without cameras. Vacations became rare moments when the man recognized on television simply returned to being dad. When Harvey looks back now at the mansions, the awards, and the career that eventually followed, he rarely describes them as the most important part of his story. Instead, he points to the home that grew around him. The man who once slept inside a car and later feared he might lose every family he ever built now sits surrounded by children who claim him without hesitation. Marjorie did not erase the past he carried. She gave him a way to live with it. And somewhere between the noise of stages and the quiet of that house, Steve Harvey discovered something success alone had never been able to offer. A place where the story of his life finally felt whole. Today, at the age of 69, Steve Harvey lives a life that reflects not only extraordinary success, but the long road it took to reach it. His estimated net worth of around $200 million places him among the most influential figures in American television. Yet, that fortune did not arrive through sudden fame. It was built piece by piece over decades of work as a comedian, radio host, television personality, producer, author, and entrepreneur. Each year, Harvey continues to earn tens of millions of dollars through programs like Family Feud, Celebrity Family Feud, and Judge Steve Harvey, while the Steve Harvey Morning Show remains one of the most widely syndicated radio programs in the United States. Through his media company, Steve Harvey Global, he also develops television formats, live events, and digital productions that extend his influence far beyond the stage. The result is not simply wealth, but a lasting business empire. One that stands in quiet contrast to the years when the future comedian once slept in his car while chasing open mic nights. Few places reveal the scale of his success more clearly than the homes he now calls his own. Harvey and his wife Marjorie live primarily in Atlanta's Buckhead district, inside a sprawling estate once owned by filmmaker Tyler Perry. The property stretches across more than 30,000 square feet and sits on expansive private grounds designed for both privacy and spectacle. Inside, high ceilings open into vast living areas where sweeping staircases and polished stone floors lead toward formal dining rooms, entertainment halls, and private lounges built for gatherings large enough to fill an entire weekend. Multiple kitchens support events and celebrations, while quiet corners of the mansion hold libraries, offices, and rooms meant for reflection away from the cameras. Outside, terraces overlook manicured lawns and resort-style pools that shimmer beneath Georgia sunlight. Earlier chapters of Harvey's life left traces across other cities as well. Luxury residences in Beverly Hills, a penthouse in Chicago overlooking Lake Michigan during the years of his talk show, and properties in Texas tied to his earlier career. Together, they form a map of a journey measured not only in square footage, but in distance traveled. Harvey's lifestyle reflects the rewards of that journey, though it has never been what defines him. His garage has at times held vehicles from some of the most prestigious brands in the world: Rolls-Royce, Bentley, Range Rover, and other luxury automobiles known for their comfort, power, and craftsmanship. Yet those symbols of prosperity exist alongside a disciplined routine that allows him to maintain the energy required for a demanding career. Known for his signature mustache and sharply tailored suits, Harvey remains attentive to health and appearance through structured workouts, balanced nutrition, and careful grooming. At times, he has adopted plant-based diets and fitness regimens to sustain the stamina needed for television production, travel, and public appearances. Even in his late 60s, he continues to host major television programs and appear regularly before live audiences, proof that his voice still carries the authority that first made him a household name. Family remains the center of his world. Harvey is the father of 7 children, including Brandy, Carly, Broderick Jr., and Winton, along with the 3 children of Marjorie, whom he embraced as his own. Their blended family has grown into a large circle that now includes grandchildren, shared business ventures, and frequent family gatherings. Although details of his estate planning remain private, Harvey has long spoken about building generational stability for his children and grandchildren. Through the Steve and Marjorie Harvey Foundation, he also directs resources toward mentoring programs for young people. Initiatives such as the Disney Dreamers Academy bring thousands of students together for mentorship and leadership training, giving many their first glimpse of opportunities they once believed impossible. In the end, the deeper meaning of Steve Harvey's life cannot be measured in houses, cars, or financial figures. Those are only the visible landmarks of a journey that began with uncertainty and rejection. The man who now stands before millions each day still carries the memory of nights spent sleeping in a car, of silent comedy clubs where the laughter never came, and of dreams that once sounded unrealistic, even to those closest to him. Perhaps that is why the applause that surrounds him today feels less like celebration and more like responsibility. Success in Harvey's life has never erased the past. It has simply illuminated how far determination can carry a person. And maybe that is the quiet truth behind a life that the world admires. Every moment of recognition also carries the unseen weight of the road that led there. If Steve Harvey's story speaks to you, share what part of his journey resonates most. Because sometimes the lives we admire are not reminders of how high someone climbed, but of how much strength it takes to keep walking long after the world starts watching.